Phrasal verbs. Get into, spend it on, wake up, sit around, talk about, listen to, think about, fall over, fold up, reach over, look after, take care of, look at, jumping around, going into, driving around, gave it away, switch it off, let it in, bring them into, get used to.
Listen.
But the problem is, in that world, there's still nothing to do to find purpose. In fact, the subgroup of humanity that has purpose is the subgroup whose job it is to expand the boundaries of our galactic civilization. In some cases, fighting wars against alien species and so on. That's the sort of cutting edge, and that's 0.01% of the population. Everyone else is desperately trying to get into that group, so they have some purpose in life. Things like football clubs. This is what I hear a lot. I've heard this 3 or 4 times. I've actually heard Sam Altman say a version of this about the amount of free time we're going to have. I've obviously also heard recently Elon talking about the age of abundance when he delivered his quarterly earnings just a couple of weeks ago. He said that there will be, at some point, 10 billion humanoid robots. His pay packet targets him to deliver 1 million of these humanoid robots a year, enabled by AI, by 2030. So, if he does that, he gets $1 trillion in compensation. I think it's part of his package. Yeah, so the age of abundance for Elon. It's not that it's absolutely impossible to have a worthwhile world of that, with that premise, but I'm just waiting for someone to describe it. So let me try and describe it. We wake up in the morning. We go to retreats and sit around and talk about stuff with each other. And maybe people still listen to podcasts. Okay, I hope so, for your sake. Yeah, it feels a little bit like a cruise ship. And there's some cruises where it's smarty bands people. And they have lectures in the evening about ancient civilizations and whatnot. And some are more popular entertainment. And this is, in fact, if you've seen the film WALL-E, this is one picture of that future. In fact, in WALL-E, the human race are all living on cruise ships in space. They have no constructive role in their society, right? They're just there to consume entertainment. There's no particular purpose to education. And they're depicted, actually, as huge, obese babies. They're actually wearing onesies to emphasize the fact that they have become enfeebled. And they become enfeebled because there's no purpose in being able to do anything, at least in this conception. WALL-E is not the future that we want. Do you think much about humanoid robots and how they're a protagonist in this story of AI? It's an interesting question, right? One of the reasons, I think, is because in all the science fiction movies, they're humanoid. So that's what robots are supposed to be because they were in science fiction before they became a reality. So even Metropolis, which is a film from 1920, I think the robots are humanoid. Basically, people covered in metal. From a practical point of view, as we have discovered, humanoid is a terrible design because they fall over. And you do want multi-fingered hands of some kind. It doesn't have to be a hand, but you want to have at least half a dozen appendages that can grasp and manipulate things. And you need something, some kind of locomotion. And wheels are great, except they don't go upstairs and over curbs and things like that. So that's probably why we're going to be stuck with legs. But a four-legged, two-armed robot would be much more practical. I guess the argument I've heard is because we've built a human world. So if we are going to some extent, yeah. But I mean, our dogs manage perfectly well to navigate around our houses and streets and so on. So if you had a centaur, it could also navigate. But it can carry much greater loads because it's quadrupedal. It's much more stable. If it needs to drive a car, it can fold up two of its legs and so on and so forth. So, I think the arguments for why it has to be exactly humanoid are sort of post hoc justification. I don't think it's a good engineering argument. I was thinking of a bloody baby gate. Those like kindergarten gates they get on stairs. Yeah, my dog can't open that. But a humanoid robot could reach over the other side. Yeah, and so could a centaur robot, right? So, in some sense, a centaur robot. There's something ghastly about the look of those, though. Well, do you know what I mean? Like a four-legged big monster, sort of crawling through my house when I have guests over. Your dog is a four-legged monster. So, I think actually I would argue the opposite. That we want a distinct form because they are distinct entities. And the more humanoid, the worse it is in terms of confusing our subconscious psychological systems. So, I'm arguing from the perspective of the people making them. Might look after my children. Obviously, I'm not saying I would allow this to look after my children. But I'm saying, from A, if I'm building a company, the manufacturer would certainly want to be. So, that's an interesting question. I mean, there's also what's called the uncanny valley, which is a phrase from computer graphics. When they started to make characters in computer graphics, they tried to make them look more human, right? So, if you look at Toy Story, for example, they're not very human-looking, right? If you look at The Incredibles, they're not very human-looking. And so we think of them as cartoon characters. If you try to make them more human, they naturally become repulsive. Until they become you have to be very, very close to perfect in order not to be repulsive. So the uncanny valley is this, like the gap between so perfectly human and not at all human. But in between, it's really awful. And so, there were a couple of movies that tried. And it's repulsive to watch. When I watched that shareholder presentation the other day, Elon had these two humanoid robots dancing on stage. And I've seen lots of humanoid robot demonstrations over the years. You know, you've seen the Boston Dynamics dog thing jumping around, and whatever else. But there was a moment where my brain, for the first time ever, genuinely thought there was a human in a suit. And I'll play it on the screen if anyone hasn't seen it, but it's just the robots dancing on stage. And I was like, that is a human in a suit. And it was really the knees that gave it away because the knees were all metal. I thought there's no way that could be a human knee in one of those suits. And he says they're going into production next year. They're used internally at Tesla now, but he says they're going into production next year. And it's going to be pretty crazy when we walk outside and see robots. I think that'll be the paradigm shift. I've heard, actually many. That will be when we realize. Yeah, I think even more so. In San Francisco, we see driverless cars driving around. And it takes some getting used to, actually, when you're driving and there's a car right next to you with no driver in it. And it's signaling and it wants to change lanes in front of you, and you have to let it in and all this kind of stuff. It's a little creepy. But I think you're right. I think seeing the humanoid robots. But that phenomenon that you described, where it was sufficiently close that your brain flipped into saying this is a human being. That's exactly what I think we should avoid. Because I have the empathy for it then. Because it's a lie. It levels the playing field between me and it, to some degree. How hard is it going to be to just switch it off and throw it in the trash when it breaks? I think it's essential for us to keep machines in the cognitive space where they are machines, and not bring them into the cognitive space where they're people. because we will make enormous mistakes by doing that.